today we're looking at a chromatic scale in octaves, starting on E. So an E chromatic scale in octaves. Watch the video for free and just pick up all the tips from the video, but if you're interested, this comes from my technique book, and there's a link for that underneath the video. And if you've been following the lessons on my YouTube channel or the site, you probably have seen the lesson that we had on scales in thirds and then scales in sixths. And now we're doing a scale in octaves. And so my book has a whole bunch of scales in thirds, sixths, octaves, and tenths. And the interesting thing is, like, when you progress from thirds, the intervals are small, right? So your fingers are close together. It's quite a compact technique. So that has certain benefits to your technique. It also teaches you a whole bunch of things about music. But thirds have a very specific technique. They really help you play on your fingertips, things like that. Scales in octaves are almost more like a finger independence exercise. So it's almost like an O'Dare's drill thing, right? Where we're in these groups and you have to when you're holding one thing, you have to prepare other fingers. So it's a really good finger independence exercise. The interval is a little bit larger, so it's even a little bit of a stretch exercise. But it's also really good for your guitar knowledge. You should be able to think of playing the guitar in octaves. This is something that jazz guitarists know really well. Pianists, no problem, of course, playing in octaves. Guitar, though, all the fingering shapes look so different that it can be very confusing, but it's definitely something musically that you want to be able to do. So let's just go over the scale a little bit together. That's the first thing we'll do. The second thing we'll do is we'll just talk about some general technique tips to consider when you're practicing octaves. But maybe before I talk about these two things, I just want to say, I think you want to be able to play this without looking at a book. So without looking at the fingerings in a book. Of course, you might want to go over it once or twice to see if you're using good fingerings. And you can copy my fingerings, of course, and the fingerings are in my book, or you can just follow the video, right, and copy them. But what I really want you to do is not think about fingering. I want you to think about octaves on the guitar. So octaves, if you don't know what octaves are, that's the two of the same note, but one octave apart. So, for example, a C, if you had a C scale, a basic C scale, this C to this C is one octave. So if you play those together, that's the interval of an octave. I don't have time to go into it in much more detail, but when you're playing this exercise, I really think you should be able to think about the scale without looking at the book. And one way to do that is to say the note names out loud. That will force you to think of what you're actually doing. So a chromatic scale goes through all the notes in the musical alphabet. So I recommend on the way up you use sharps, and on the way down you use flats. So you want to be thinking in your mind, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp, E. And then on the way down, you just think in terms of flats, so like E flat, D flat, C, B flat, A flat, G flat, F, and onward down, E flat, etc., etc. So you want to be able to play a chromatic scale because you know how the guitar works, you know where the notes are on the guitar. You're not just going to memorize a whole bunch of fingerings, but you actually want to know how to play octaves. So if you just say those note names out loud and find the notes, then you'll learn the shapes very efficiently and you'll know the guitar a little bit better than you did before. Memorizing the fingering does almost nothing for you. I mean, I want you to use good fingering, but it doesn't really help you learn anything, right? It might help you learn some good fingering for a scale, but it doesn't help you learn the guitar. And I think when you're practicing technique, there's a real opportunity sometimes to learn about your instrument. And you'll find that the more you know about your instrument, the more that you'll be able to sight read more easily, Devour a repertoire because you'll recognize shapes and patterns. If you look at a piece and it has a whole bunch of octaves and you say like, oh, those are octaves, you can memorize that music really quickly because you know what it is, and you might know what the shapes are already. So you don't really have to like even practice it. You're able to play it. So it's pretty straightforward exercise, but use free fingers. So like if you're using this finger down, then use these two fingers, and then these two fingers. So really trying to use free fingers whenever possible. And in this exercise, that's quite possible. Most of the time, the fingering works out that you get to never repeat a fingering until here, where you're just going to guide the fingers up. And make sure you're using the strings as a guide so you don't actually take your fingers off the strings, but you hold them down. And then you're just going all the way up like that. Like you'll notice like those octave shapes, like jazz players, will play melodies in octaves all the time, like Wes Montgomery style stuff. So like they really know their octave shapes. Sometimes even in ensemble music, we'll play something in octaves to give it more fullness and make it louder even, if we have to do that. Some technique tips for you. All the same technique tips that a basic exercise requires, you want to make sure you observe. So in my book, it's laid out in a pretty progressive way. So if you're working on left-hand exercises, you should start off by just like doing one finger at a time, playing with curved fingers, playing on your fingertips, playing close to the fret as much as possible. All those good technique tips, thumb behind the second finger, those kinds of ideas. As you progress through exercises, you start going to scales. So the patterns are different, but you maintain all those tips I just mentioned. When shifts come into the play, you make sure that your thumb is shifting with your hand and you're still playing on your fingertips with curved fingers, all those things. And then you go into thirds, and you have to do that same thing. You have to curve your fingers, play on your fingertips. And then you move into sixths. And then you start playing octaves like this. And the thing you'll find is just harder to maintain your good technique when the exercise is more difficult. But that's why you want to make sure that you've progressed in and built a foundation of strong technique with easy exercises. That way, when you play things like octaves, you'll have a good, strong foundation for what you're doing. And if you go slowly, you should, although two fingers are being used at a time, lots of the time, you should still be able to maintain all those technique tips. But you might find it hard with certain finger combinations, like it's my little jaws thing. But this is some tough finger independence, But while maintaining that finger independence, you still have to play on your fingertips and curve your fingers and all that stuff, and it's a real challenge. So make sure that if you're practicing this exercise, that you have a really strong foundation, because if you're playing really sloppy through this exercise, then maybe you shouldn't be working on it. You should go back to something a little bit easier and refresh until you're ready to play this one. Either that, or you just have to go much slower and make sure you're controlling your fingers so that they're always ready. One last technical tip. When you're holding one note, like after the first note, make sure you prepare your fingers in the air for the notes that come next, so that when they go to play, they just have to drop into place. So then these two fingers are hovering over their notes. Then they play. This finger's hovering over its note. These fingers are hovering over their notes. So that when they actually go to play, they're just moving down into the guitar. You can think of it as preparation of the left hand in mid-air. You want to make sure that as soon as you've played one note, that the other fingers are ready. We talk about this in the right hand with planting sometimes, but we don't talk about it in the left hand maybe as often as we should. But I used to have a teacher who would make me play through my exercises and tap the next note before playing it. So I'd play the first note, and then I'd have to tap the notes I was going to play next. then play them, then tap the next notes, then play them, then tap the next note, then tap the next note. It was super tedious, but it actually is a really good idea. Having your fingers ready for what they're about to do before they have to do it is a way of preparing the left hand for success, which helps accuracy, and it can also help with speed, because if your hand is ready to go, then it's ready to play, right? So many things I could talk about. I could ramble on for another, an hour, but nevertheless, approach the exercise slowly, think about some of those ideas, and try to learn to play your octaves without the music.